some people have talked about what makes Christianity unique. And I know there was a famous answer by C.S. Lewis, and he said grace. And I don't pretend to be C.S. Lewis, but I don't think it's correct. I think there's grace in other religions. I think there's grace in Judaism. There's grace in other religions. What makes Christianity unique, and I'm with N.T. Wright on this, is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So let's look at the resurrection. Pull up the PowerPoint here. And there we go. So remember that empty grave. This is a grave such as the grave that Jesus would have been in, basalt stone, and it was empty. The Apostle Paul, a missionary who later on traveled the Mediterranean world to talk about the story of Jesus and start Jesus Communities churches, wrote to one of the churches in Greece. And he said, Jesus was buried and he was raised on the third day, just like the scriptures talked about. He appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, one of his apostles, and then to the 12 disciples. And then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time. So followers, most of whom at that time were still alive. Some have died. And then he appeared to James, Jesus' brother, we assume, and then to all the messengers. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. By untimely born, he was not there for all the other affairs, but he appeared to him on the road to Damascus, and we will learn that story later. Well, not everybody buys the resurrection. I mean, this is exploding information, as if it wasn't enough to believe that Jesus came as a baby. Can you imagine this idea of someone defeating death? I mean, it defies all natural law, right? So some objections to that. So people say, that those are just religious ideas. Things just don't happen like that, right? And other people pointed out just some real logical points here. They said, all the people that supposedly, like Paul talked about, saw Jesus, they're all insiders to the story. Of course, they're going to back it up. They want to keep the story alive. Other objections have been this. They said, well, the people that wrote about it, they're also insiders. So why would they write against it? Some people said, resurrection came as a later belief. And there's some truth to that. In the Old Testament, the earlier part of the story, resurrection belief is really just not there. There is that resurrection belief at the end of human history, that God will raise up the saints. But resurrection belief as in the here and now, Jesus rising, someone rising from the dead, while everybody else still keeps trucking. Yeah, no, that wasn't really there. It's not talked about. There's not this idea of people going to heaven. There's the idea of Sheol, people going to sleep until that later date. A little bit in the testamental periods, a little bit of this consciousness rises of that day of the Lord, of that end. But no, so some people said they made it up later. And then there's this idea of the swoon theory. The textbook does not talk about that, but especially in Europe, this is a big thing. At one point, this theory came around and said, maybe Jesus was just so severely mistreated, so severely beaten, that when they laid him in that cold grave, it's kind of like we have this in the Netherlands. When people go under the ice, when they fall through the ice and you think they're dead, what actually happens is all the processes in the body slow down, the enzymes slow down, enzyme activity reduces, and you can actually be underwater or in a compromised cold situation for a longer time, for a prolonged period of time, where normally people would succumb to that. But it's kind of like comatose, and you kind of swoon, you kind of hover between life and death. And then later on, Jesus just revived. Well, okay, so you health people and nurses, that's quite something, because somebody like that would be in severe shock. And when we find them under the ice, we take them to the ICU and we work like crazy to bring these people back. They need fluid, they need warmth, the body temperature is too low. I mean, this is something else. And Jesus would have had to do all of this on his own and then find a way out of that grave. And at the end of the day, that would not be resurrection, right? That would be resuscitation. So what about in the other side? What are some support themes of the resurrection that says, yes, it happens? Well, in part, because, like we said in the other side, because it is not really developed thinking in the Old Testament, it really was not a part of the disciples' expectations. And yet they were the ones proclaiming it. Also, like we said, it really didn't feature in the Hebrew Bible, except for this idea of in the end. So this is not something that they already had in the arsenal of excuses. This is something that just fell on them. Here's one that I think is key. This is so convincing to me. If you want to come up with a hoax, right? So play along with me here. The story is going south. These people are following a Messiah figure, a leader of a movement, and then the movement goes down south. They grab the leader and they actually kill the leader. You're thinking, oh goodness, this was such a successful movement. We want to keep it alive. Now they killed the leader. We have to come up with some excuse to keep this thing, keep the momentum, keep it going. We got to come up with a story. So let's just say people stole the body, or let's just say people saw him. Let's just say there were witnesses. If you want, in that context, if you want to come up with witnesses, you would have come up with a story that had strong male witnesses. You would not have a story where in every one of the stories there were female witnesses. Why? As you could read in the textbook as well, female witnesses did not hold up in court. The testimony of a female did not have any kind of convincing power. Women could just not go to court. If they went to court, a male went with it. This is a patriarchal society. The words of females did not hold power. And every one of these stories has women there as first observers. And it's the women who tell the man. That is the weakest hoax I've ever heard of. So if you're going to come up with a story, come up with a strong one. So this to me is so convincing. You couldn't dream it up if you thought of it. And the other one is the lives and faith of the disciples. What kind of movement were they going to keep going? If Jesus was killed and their lives were in danger, they were seen as people that were rising up against the Roman authorities. They were seen as people who were not in favor of the Jewish system. There was nothing to be rescued. They had to run for their life. So why keep this going if the leader is not alive? And then when you follow the stories of these leaders, of the original disciples, nearly all of them, if not all of them, died horrible deaths. Now, we know people that die death is unnecessary. They have some sort of martyrdom syndrome, right? But all of them, some of them we know that Peter had a family, and some of them were parted in 4 parts, and they were crucified upside down, and they were sawn in 2, and they were beheaded. And really, you would only do that if you truly believe that what you saw was human history. That makes it believable for me. Now, of course, this is a choice that you make for yourself. So the early Christians came up with a statement of faith, a proclamation called the Kerygma. This was the Kerygma. We find this in the writings. The Kerygma was that Jesus has fulfilled the promises of the Old Testament, the promise that somebody would come to restore. They also proclaimed that God was at work in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. This was God doing, that he had now been exalted to heaven, to the heavenly realm, but that he would come back. He will soon return in glory. And if you hear this message, it's not just information you take in, it requires a response to this challenge, and a willingness to change your lifestyle and to follow Jesus, no matter the consequences.